friends, it's Lisa Hetrick. Welcome back to my channel. I have a really fun watercolor project to share with you today, and it's inspired by all of these wispy wildflowers that I've been painting lately. I've been sharing these out in social media and in my email list, but I decided that I wanted to do a little tutorial video as we're easing into 2022 and talk a little bit about watercolor along the way. So these are the fun things that I've been doing lately, and I've been experimenting with all of my watercolors. And it occurred to me that it would be fun to share this in a video. So I have a lot of supplies here, and all of the supplies will be listed down below. I'm just kind of running through them real quick, but I will be using my Schmincke watercolors, and you can see me struggling to get them out of the tin because it's just easier for me to use them when I'm shooting video just out of the tin. And I'm playing with this Princeton Neptune. They call this a cat's tongue brush. So kind of fun. I really liked it because I thought it would be fun to create different kind of brush strokes that were like petals. I'm also playing with some of the Strathmore Ready Cut watercolor, 100% cotton paper. It's a little bit more white than the Arches watercolor paper, which I love, but I thought I would give this a go. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So these Neptune brushes are super thirsty. So sometimes I have a little problem working with them. I love super washy thirsty brushes when I'm doing like loose watercolor, like super washy. But this one is going to be a mix of both. So I'm starting out with some of the magenta watercolor from the Schmincke set. And I am starting out with my typical way that I start out my flowers. And that is to set 5 little anchor points, so to speak, with color. And it just kind of gives me a place to begin and a sense of where I'm going to go with my petals. Now, the reason why I wanted to experiment with this unusual brush is because it makes the most beautiful brushstroke florals. And I'm just kind of playing around with it. I have a lot of water in this brush, and I picked up quite a bit of pigment, but there's also a lot of water. So you can see like right away with that magenta watercolor that there isn't a ton. It's very washy. It's very watered down. So this is an example of using what I call like skim milk. So it's got a skim milky kind of water to paint ratio. And you can see I'm holding the brush really close. A, because I'm left-handed. B, because it's a little bit easier for you to see me making these brush strokes when I hold it a little bit closer. And I feel like I get more control by holding the brush a little bit closer to the tip. So I'm having some fun with this. Now I'm pulling away some of the water. One of the things about watercolor, even now for me, is practicing my water to paint ratios. So, and that is controlling like how much water is on my brush, how much pigment I'm picking up. And with the Schmincke watercolors, like every single watercolor brand is a little bit different. So sometimes these paintings and these practice paintings of mine are all about really getting reintroduced to my watercolor sets because they're all a little bit different. Now, Schmincke is super vibrant. Look at how beautiful and vibrant those colors are. And there's a big payoff of the color when you first lay it down. But when you're working with it in these light washes, I enjoy working with it in this light washes because the Schmincke is really good for glazing, which means building up color, letting the floral dry in between and building up color. So you're going to see me start with doing 3 different florals here. Now I'm bringing in some of the transparent orange and quinacridone gold, I believe. And I've got them over here in their little wellies in this porcelain plate over here. And I'm just kind of playing around now between the brush and the pigment and the water and getting like that ratio between the two that I'm looking for. I want it to be not super skim milky, but I want it to not be like a huge amount of pigment coming out. So this is going to be a 3-petaled flower. So I'm just putting a little bit of the pigment on the brush, this little cat's tongue brush. It's super fun. Look how light that is. And I'm just kind of playing with the tip. I love the fact that this brush, when you paint with the whole belly of the brush, you get this beautiful petal, beautiful flower petal. And then that super tip there, that tip of it allows you to just get really refined line drawings with it. I just love it. So you can illustrate with it and paint with it. It's super fun. So I'm going around here and I'm this brush is super thirsty. So it's taking a lot of water and a lot of pigment. But you can see there's a lot of water here. So part of this experiment too, and part of practicing is understanding how much water is on your brush, how much pigment is on your brush, and what that payoff is going to be when you start to paint. And when you begin to understand your paints and how they work and how your brush is working and how much water you've got on your brush, you'll start to feel a little more comfortable with watercolor. Now, I'm pulling away. This is a lifting technique. So while the paper is still wet, I'm pulling away some of that pigment because, again, I am coming out of the gate here, creating these flowers with a light wash to begin with. And then I'm going to be going back in and glazing a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a moment. I'm pulling in another piece of watercolor, and I want to talk again about this water to paint ratio. So I dipped my brush into some of that transparent orange, which is a gorgeous color, and took and painted it down in its full strength, or it's called mass tone. So full strength. And you can see by adding more water to that pigment, and you get this graduated look of color going down from dark to light. So the more water you add to your paint, the lighter of a wash of color you can achieve. And that's what I'm starting out with this painting. Because I know that Schmincke is a beautiful, beautiful watercolor, highly transparent, and has remarkable results with the paint. I can achieve remarkable results with it by doing the glazing technique. So look at that magenta rose, absolutely gorgeous in mass tone, which is the whole solid wash of color. So right out of the gate, that paint has an intense amount of color. And as I add water to the pigment, you can see I can go from this like darker rose to these really, really pale, washy pinks. That is the magic, friends. That is the magic of watercolor. How you can take one color and really go from a dark to a light and everything in between. But it takes a little bit of patience. Okay, so I'm going to start to work on the third bloom. Sometimes patience isn't always our forte, right? Who's got their hand raised? I do. Sometimes with our watercolor, we want just an intense payout of color like right away. And we don't want to mess around with creating layers. And we just want a lot of color, and we just want it to be beautiful right out of the gate. Now, you can do that. You just need to understand your watercolor, what kind of watercolor brand you're working with, and you need to understand your water to paint ratios. So I'm going in here and I'm making another 3-petal flower, and I've got a little bit of lemon yellow. Now, look, and I'm going for full color payout with that lemon yellow. So you can see that I'm just dipping in. I dipped into the lemon yellow, and then I went full belly of the brush and got that full color payout, that full mass tone of color in my brush. Look at that. Oh, I just love that color. It's so transparent and so beautiful. So also, because it's yellow, it is a lot paler. Now, one of the things I want to share as I'm starting to work on the stems here and just kind of getting, completing the flower stems, is that all watercolors, when they dry, shift a little bit. And by shifting, I mean is when they dry, they tend to be lighter in color than when you first painted them onto your watercolor paper. Now, a lot of things can affect this. It could be how much pigment, the quality of the paint you're working with, and how much pigment is in the paints and the paint brand. And it also can have a lot to do with the kind of paper you're working with. I like to work with 100% cotton paper. It's just because I like thirsty papers. 100% cotton papers across many brands are just beautiful papers to work with. I use cold press. It's got a little bit of a rougher texture to it, and because I like that added texture to my watercolor paintings. When you use a wood pulp paper or a 140-pound paper like a Canson or other brands that are on the market, a wood pulp paper is not 100% cotton. It is a wood pulp that's compressed together. It's got a different texture. Color tends to float on top of the watercolor paper. It moves around. It doesn't sink into the fibers of the paper. So those are some of the things that make papers different. And I go into a lot of detail about papers in some other videos and in my classroom at craftyourjoy.com. Just kind of wanted to keep it a little bit light here today. But if you have any questions about watercolor papers, feel free to put them in the comments or direct message me. Now, I'm diving in here a little bit more with this green, and I want to show you something that I'm doing with my brush. I have this technique that I do with the brush when I'm doing petals. That one looks like a hot mess, so I'm going to move on. Now, I'm dipping my brush into an olive green, and I've got it over here in the wellies, and you can see that I've got a lot of pigment on this brush. Now, I'm making a leaf by dragging the brush away from me, and I get this beautiful leaf shape that is the size of the brush. So the size of the brush, no matter what you're working with, you could be working with a large brush or a small brush. You can create varying sizes of leaves depending upon what the belly of the brush, what brush size you have. Now, this is just one way that I make leaves, brush stroke leaves. It makes it super simple. No illustration experience required. Now I'm going to show you this really fun technique where I spin the brush while I'm painting, and I'm able to get some varying colors and textures. This one's a tough one, a little bit of a tough one. It takes a little bit of practice. Okay, let's dive in. I am getting a lot of pigment on my brush, and I dipped the tip of my brush in a little bit of turquoise, and you can see that I am dragging the brush towards me, but I'm also spinning the brush while I'm dragging. Now, let's take a peek. I'm dragging the brush towards me and spinning the brush at the same time. Now, I loaded my brush with 2 different colors of pigment, but watch, you can see with that spinning, you get a little bit more texture in the flow of the leaf. You can see like some lines where the pigments kind of went into the paper. I've got the tip of the brush that has a different color loaded on it, so you get a little bit more of a variegation of color simply by spinning the brush while you're painting. Now, this is a super fun technique. It takes a lot of practice, but you can I wouldn't say a lot of practice. It takes some practice for sure, but you can do this with any brush that you have. Rounds work really well, or this cat's tongue, or just something that has a big belly in it. So let's go ahead and do it again. You can see that I start with the tip, and then I use the entire belly of the brush, and I'm spinning the brush in my fingers while I'm painting it. And you go from the left to the right and just kind of fill in the middle and just keep doing that technique. But what you get, the end result that you get, is just this beautiful variegation of color. And because I loaded the brush with 2 different colors, this time it was an olive green and a little bit of turquoise, you get a lot of variety of texture in your leaves. And it's just super whimsical. I love it. So I would love to see you try this technique. It's a little, I've never shared it before, and it's a little challenging. It can be, and not every single leaf is going to work out the way you want it to. But you can see here is a little bit of a lighter one that has mostly the turquoise color. And this one works really, really well if you load up your brush with a dominant color like a green or a blue with your leaves, and then dip the tip of your brush in another watercolor so that you can create those leaves. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and move on. Now everything is dry, and we're going to go back in and start adding another layer of color. This is called glazing. And you can see that I'm going in here. My brush is wet. I've got quite a bit of pigment on here. I'm building up the layers of these beautiful wispy petals. And I just kind of went around like a pinwheel and added a little bit of color to one side of the petal. Now I'm cleaning off my brush. I'm getting it nice and super, super clean. And now I'm just going to go in with water, just water, using the tip of the brush, and I'm going to blend out that edge a little bit, not all the way out to the entire edge of the bloom, but I am blending it out just a little bit to get this second layer of color here. And I'm just dabbing in a little bit of water and moving the pigment that's already on the paper around. Now, with this particular brand of watercolor, the more water I add, the more it's going to kind of run, and I get like these blooms of color, and that's okay. Blooms of water and blooms of pigment. That's because I've got a lot of water going here. So I'm trying to control the water a little bit. This brush is super thirsty, so it's going to hold a lot of water. If I don't want so much water showing up on my project, I've got to get that water off, so I'm kind of pushing it out of the brush. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the little orange blossom here, and I'm doing the same technique. I've got quite a bit of pigment on the brush, and I'm just using the belly of the brush, and I'm adding that pigment to one edge, and then I'm just blending it out a little bit. Now, what you can start to see in these blooms is that the layers underneath them are starting to look like little papery white blooms underneath. You can start to see the layers underneath and the layers on top, because the watercolors, this watercolor brand, and mostly all watercolor brands, are very transparent. Some are a little more opaque, but this brand is super transparent. All of the layers from underneath are going to shine through my work here, and it gives it that glow. You could see this little orange blossom here. While the paper was wet, I just dropped a little bit more of that transparent orange right there at the bottom of those little blooms, just to create another layer of color to get some variation. Just love it. Okay, so now I'm doing the same technique with that lemon yellow, and the yellow is super, super transparent. I don't have to move that color around that much. I'm going back in with a little bit of the quinacridone gold right at the belly here of where the blooms are, and just kind of letting that color bloom out. So it's kind of spidering out. You see, it's following the flow of the water. Wherever there is watercolor, wherever there's water, watercolor will flow into it. Watercolor will not flow where water isn't. So it's just, you can control that part. So I'm just dropping a little bit in, and I'm using what's on the paper and just kind of spreading it around the bloom a little bit, just to add a little bit more color there. You can start to see these 3 blooms are popping now compared to when we first began, when they were very, very pale. Okay, we're going to take another. Now everything is dry. I've let everything dry in between, and we're going back in for another layer of color. So again, this technique is called glazing, but I'm not taking the paint and covering everything that I have already done. I'm just adding in more dense color from the center out and off to one side a little bit so that I can see it, and then I'm going to blend it out a little bit. Now, doing this is super simple. I call these brushstroke blooms. If you're doing more botanical work, like realistic botanical work, it's a little bit of it's a way different technique. This is just a great way to create some abstract, whimsical blooms, and we're doing some glazing and getting to know our watercolor along the way. You can see that I've got a clean brush now, and I'm just moving that color around a little bit and just letting it be. So you can see in this flower all of the different layers. Look at the different layers of that bloom. We've got some darks, we've got some lights. Now I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to blend this out a little bit so that you can see. I'm not covering the entire petal, because if I did, you wouldn't see all of the variations of color coming through, and you wouldn't see the layers of the petal, which makes it really, really interesting and glowy. Okay. Now I'm just kind of loading up my brush and my wellies again, and I'm just going to play here a little bit with creating the leafery for these cute little wildflowers. So I've got a little bit of my olive green, and I dipped it into that little bit of turquoise, and I'm loading my brush with 2 different colors and just kind of working my way around the painting. I'm using the entire belly of the brush to create these little leafery blooms, and just keeping it super simple. Now, I don't have a ton of water on this brush, and that's why when I paint and use that whole belly of the brush, you can see sometimes the tip of it gets a little dry. It's because I need a little bit more water on the brush to complete that tip of the leaf. So I'm just kind of playing around here really softly with the tip and just adding a little bit more color and a little bit more finish to the stems of these beautiful wildflower blooms that are just kind of growing up and a little bit wonky and wild and just fun. Now, I'm using that same glazing technique and adding a little bit of the green, the olive green, to the areas of these 2 little blossoms, and just adding another layer also creates a little bit more glow, a little more intensity of color. Cleaning off that brush, look at that tip. It's just such a fun brush. And again, everything that I used in this little mini tutorial, all the links are down in the description. But you can use whatever you have in your stash and paint along with me. It would be super, super fun. Okay. I'm just playing and adding a few little finishing touches to the painting. I've just got a little bit of stem work here and just adding a few tiny little like hairs at the top of the stem, adding a little bit more density to the green color, and just having some fun with it. I'm loving the way these blossoms are looking. They have so much variation in color, and they look very wispy and wildflower like, and yeah, super simple fun painting that just comes together. No illustration experience required. We're just using our brush to create these brush strokes. Okay. So now I've got a little bit of a finer point brush, and this is a Princeton Neptune as well, but you could use whatever fine point you have. And I've got not a lot of water on this brush, but a ton of pigment on the tip of the brush. And I dipped it into the violet watercolor, and I'm just working from the center of the flower out, and I'm using a technique called flicking, and I'm flicking the color out into these like little hair-like flicks to create a little bit more visual interest for the center of the flower, which is where the stamens are. So I'm going around here and I'm adding a few little dots with the tip just to create that stamen look from the center of the floral. And this is just a little finishing technique. You could skip this part if you wanted to, but I'm going to just continue here just to draw a little bit of attention to a focal point in the center of the flower. I also think it really just kind of helps pop and give this a little bit more of a 3D look in texture and feel, and I'm kind of loving it. This is the part of your painting where sometimes it's a little hard to decide, am I finished or should I keep going? I'm just going to keep going for a minute. I dipped my brush into some water and I'm blending out some of the edges of these leaves that look like the paper was super thirsty and I didn't have enough water on my brush. So I'm just blending out those edges a little bit just to soften them. And yeah, just doing a couple little finishing techniques here, resisting the urge to add more color and just feeling like it's done. Now, look at all of the layers of the petals. Because of that glazing that we did, I'm getting really excited. You can see all of the layers and the colors underneath coming through and a little bit of that granulation from those certain colors and the paper texture. This is what I love about watercolor. The pigments, the water, all of the color just kind of finds its way into the paper and finds its way into the fibers and gives us this beautiful texture while we're painting. Okay, so I'm going to finish this off with a little bit of a splatter technique. I want to add just a little bit of, doll up the whimsy a little bit more. So I've got a lot of pigment on my brush. I've got a little bit of turquoise here, and I'm just tapping it onto another brush and just letting some of these little splatters of turquoise go down onto the watercolor paper here. I'm trying to be careful and not get it on my blooms. I don't really want any splatters on my blooms right now, but sometimes I do. But this time I just kind of wanted to add a little bit of that turquoise color just to kind of dial up the whimsy a little bit. And I'm just loving the way this looks. It is... I just love it. It's just super fun. And it was really easy, a great way to practice with my paints and look at all of that texture and dimension. And with a really, really simple painting, just using the tip of our brush and the belly of the brush to create these beautiful, beautiful blooms. Hope you enjoyed this wispy wildflower tutorial. I would love to see you in my online classroom at craftyourjoy.com. I have a lot of online classes to share, and you can use code craftyourjoy for $5 off any of my classes in my classroom. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider sharing the joy by liking this video and subscribing to this channel. And you can take a look at some of my other card and watercolor tutorials right here. Again, I'm so grateful you could join me, and I'll see you next time.